Good to see you all back. And we've reached the part in today's proceedings, which is the discussion panel, and that's called the Politics of Metadata. This panel session is going to be chaired by Joseph Marshall, Chair of the SCURL Collections and Metadata Group and Associate Director of Collections Management at the National Library of Scotland. Panel members will be Duncan Chappell, Librarian and Collections Manager at the Glasgow School of Art, Dr. Leo Konstantelos, the Digital Archivist at the University of Glasgow, Andrew Makesh, Cataloguing and Metadata Manager at the University of Strathclyde, and Dr. Diane M. Rasmussen Pennington, Professor of Social Informatics at Edinburgh Napier University. If I'll just hand over to you, Joe, thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeanette, and thanks everyone for being here today. I hope you've all enjoyed the session so far as much as I have, and I'm really looking forward to what we discuss in the next 45 minutes. So we're very much hoping that this will be a conversation, and I'd encourage everyone here to join in the conversation. So please drop questions into the Q&A section, and we'll try to pick those up in the course of the conversation, and really look forward to hearing what we all have to share. I'm going to ask all the panel members just to say a few minutes about their own work. I guess I should probably start because I'll be brief. I started out in the library as a cataloguing assistant nearly 23 years ago now, my goodness. And that was back in the day when we were moving from cards onto the online catalogue. And I think it's fair to say that at the time, nobody had any awareness or consciousness of the issues that we're talking about today. I think if you had a session then about the politics of metadata, people wouldn't really have even been sure what you were talking about. So there's certainly been a huge shift over those 20 years, and I think we're in for significant shifts in the years ahead. So if I can just call out the panel members by name, and if you can just tell us a bit about the work that you're doing. Perhaps I'll start, Diane, with you. I know you've spoken already, but do you want to just say a little bit more about your background and what you do?
Sure. I am a former academic librarian. I was a systems and cataloging librarian, if you couldn't tell, for a number of years in the United States. I did my PhD at looking at issues in image indexing and representation of photographs. And I worked in different academic positions, both in the US and Canada, before I came to Strathclyde in 2015, where I ran the Information Library Studies course there until the end of last year. And then I moved to Napier starting in January. And now I am the director for the Center for Social Informatics. For those of you who may have known my predecessor, Professor Hazel Hall, who's retired, she's now emeritus professor. So we still have her around, which is excellent for me as I try to take over this role and figure out what's going on. But social informatics, for those of you who don't know, looks at the sort of the intersection between people and technology and information, which falls right into obviously a lot of this work as well as my other research.
Thanks, Diane. That's fantastic. Duncan, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. So great to see so many people today's session. Yeah, I'm Duncan Chappell. I'm the Librarian and Collections Manager at Glasgow School of Art. So we're a small specialist institution, probably significantly smaller than a lot of the institutions that are attending today. About 2,500 staff and students, undergraduate right up to research. And we have a relatively small collection, 85,000 print resources and about 100,000 electronic resources. So compared to some of the collections that I'm sure some of you are managing, it's relatively small and compact. About 20 to 25 staff in the library. And as I said, I head up the collections team. I just want to start by saying that although I'm the collections manager, I mean, most of the work in this area has been done actually by my colleagues, Bridget McCall, our assistant librarian, and also Jenna Meek, one of our collections assistants, who are both here today, as well as lots of other people in the library as well. But I guess we've been on a bit of a journey with this recently. Since about 2016, we started with this work, looking at our special collections. But then we started moving in recent years onto our lending collections and looking at problematic language within the metadata there. We had a huge boost in that we had Carissa Chu, who came to work with us last summer, which a number of the speakers have mentioned Carissa and her work before. And Carissa was a huge help for us in terms of coming up with just the logistics of it, just workflows and guidance documents for us. So that's really helped us in terms of looking at advisory notices, in our catalogue, subject indexing, which we all know is problematic, and just about how we approach this area. I'll just finish off by saying I think our philosophy with regards to this is we very much view it as part of a kind of ethical practice for us, but also for our students. You know, a huge amount of emphasis in the students in the art school in their pedagogy is about ethical practice and about positioning themselves within ethical practice. So when we put an advisory notice in a catalogue record, you know, for us it's not about censorship, but it's about activating that resource and making it directly relevant to students by positioning it within a contemporary debate. And students have, for the most part, responded to that really well. That's all I'll say at the moment. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Duncan. That's great. Leo, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Joe, and hi, everyone. I'm Leo Konstantelos. As Julian said, I'm the digital archivist at the University of Glasgow. I'm based in archives and special collections. I come from a quite varied background. I am not a librarian and I'm not an archivist per se. My background is in computing and information science. I did my PhD in long-term preservation of what we broadly call born digital cultural heritage. This is when we started identifying issues with problematic terminology when looking at preserving such objects as virtual worlds and massive online role-playing games where people would communicate their views in their own way. And we needed somehow to safeguard against both the context and the content, but also make sure that the language, when inappropriate, was flagged. I was a lecturer in information studies. I was a lecturer in digital cultural heritage at the University of Glasgow for a number of years. So much of what we will be talking about today has been informed by the views of my students and their needs, but also my needs as a lecturer. For 4 years, I was the head of digital scholarship at the University of Melbourne, where we did a substantial piece of work around these areas, especially when it came to Indigenous populations. For those of you who know a little bit of the Australian context, you will know that this is a very problematic area in terms of representation within records. And it was only more recently, a year and a half ago, that I started in this post within archives and special collections. And my perspective predominantly comes from preserving digital records for the long term and the kinds of documentation and representation information that we include, not just for now, not just for what we understand today, but also in terms of what we will be able to understand in 50 or 100 years' time.
Thanks very much. That's great, Lou. And finally, Andrew.
Hello, I'm Andy McCainch. I'm cataloguing and metadata manager in the library at the University of Strathclyde. My own background is I've been working in various different cataloguing roles since about 2011. So I've worked in moving image collection, I've worked in a medical library, I've worked with rare books, and in 2019 I moved to the cataloguing and metadata team at Strathclyde. So there's been different, political and ethical considerations to think of with the metadata in each of these different collections. In the time that I've been at Strathclyde, there's been a big push across the library and across the university more generally towards better inclusion, making the campus and the library and our collections more inclusive, more welcoming for a more diverse group of users. And obviously in the library, the metadata is really at the core of that. Whether everybody across the rest of the university realises that or not, that the metadata really is a big part of what drives a lot of this work. So it has become a pretty key part of the work that we've been doing in the cataloguing team over the past few years. At the moment, we'll sort of harken back to something that Ellie, the first speaker earlier on, mentioned, talking about the difference between quick wins and long-term objectives. At the moment, we're doing a bit of kind of mopping up of some of our quick wins, I would say. We share similar frustrations to people in other institutions with the problems with our metadata. And I think where we can quite quickly mop up some of those issues is where we've got sort of localized practice already. So we're looking at things like we have an in-house set of subject headings for our children's literature collection that is quite badly in need of upgrading. So we're concentrating quite a lot of our efforts this year on doing that kind of work. It's similar actually to the work that Anne was talking about in the previous session. And we've got things like an in-house classification scheme for our literature collections that shares some of the issues that Diane highlighted earlier about how different languages and literatures are given an inordinate amount of space in the classification scheme. This is an in-house scheme, but it's sort of based off UDC and Dewey. So we've got some of those issues as well, and we're looking at sort of getting moving some things around and better representing what we've got in the collection, and given it is a diverse collection, but I don't think that the classification scheme necessarily represents that. So that's becoming another big focus of our work at the moment. That's me.
So very much, Andrew. So we've got a really interesting range of experiences, fantastic knowledge on the panel. Can I start out actually with a question left over from earlier? This was a question from Emma Booth asked after Diane's presentation. And this is a question for all or any of the panel. How can we best advocate with our library leaders to make EDI and metadata a priority? And I mean, and this I feel very, very passionate about myself. I mean, none of us have got all the resource that we would like for cataloguing and description. There are always competing priorities. How do we make the case that doing EDI things with this metadata is really important? It needs to be done. It needs to be resourced and prioritized.
I can jump in there briefly, Joe, if you'd like. I mean, I think in some ways we were quite lucky in the art school in that we have quite a small student cohort, as I explained, but a very active one when it comes to this kind of issue, equality, diversity. They're very vocal in what they would like from the institution, and they're very vocal in the institutional change they would like to see. So to a certain extent, we've been able to ride that wave and co-opt it. And certainly we've always presented what we do in the library as kind of in step with those student activities and initiatives. And we've worked quite closely with our student societies, for example. We have very close working relationships with our student societies. Our assistant librarians in particular work very closely with them. I think to a certain extent that's the benefit of being in a small institution, that it's a very small localized community that tends to run off of personal relationships. Yeah, I think it's often, I think as soon as you've got the student voice on board, quite often the people who make the decisions are able to sort of sit up and take notice then when you've got the student voice actually advocating for what you want to do.
That's fascinating, Duncan. And do you have formal means for capturing that student feedback, or is it very much informal, personal relationship?
I mean, a mixture, really. I mean, we obviously do have formal fora and things like, you know, the annual library survey and that kind of stuff that I'm sure all institutions are doing. But I have to say that within the art school, I mean, just the way that the place works, actually a lot gets done just on personal relationships, actually, and just interacting with people. And I think for us, that route through using the student societies has been really key, I think, about building those relationships and then maintaining them over time.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Would anyone else from the panel like to respond to that question about advocacy?
Well, I guess I can speak a little bit from the perspective of a larger institution like the University of Glasgow, where we have quite a lot of stuff that we need to manage between archives, special collections, and if we include the Hunterian, that brings quite a voluminous set of stuff that need to be maintained and looked at. But the teams managing them are not equally as large as is commonly the case in our field. So quite often making the case is difficult because there are many other areas that are seen as a priority, not because the importance of incorporating EDI considerations into the records is seen as negligible, just because it is understood that it is quite a quite a substantial piece of work that requires dedicated time, which we don't have. So in most cases, and because there are student voices, but in the large institution, it is sometimes difficult to generate enough traction, especially when it's from, let's say, minority groups. The best way to make sure that, you know, the leadership groups hear about this and understand the need for it is through engagement with societies, organizations, and so on, who are active in this area. When I was at the University of Melbourne, this certainly worked. We were working with groups like IATSE, which specifically focus on Indigenous Australian issues, and they were able to create that leverage because they have the means to publicize what they do. And whether we like it or not, academic institutions, especially in terms of leadership, there is a big component of, you know, the kudos that you get from these things. It shouldn't be that way, but I tend to be a pragmatist, so this is what I've experienced. And building on that momentum of the kudos, you know, it's a little bit like, unfortunately, piggybacking on it, but that's a way of promoting these areas and making sure that essential pieces of work are completed and investment is made in them.
That's really nicely argued, Leo. Thank you. That's great. And Diane, you want to come in here?
I just did a quick opportunity, just a plug to join the metadata and discovery group. Within both in Scotland, if you're in Scotland, but also the bigger one, which I am currently chair of, because that is a major part of what we do, is advocate for metadata and all the needs surrounding that. I think that within our profession as well, we have a lot of advocacy work to do, and otherwise that's why this question came up, I think, to help people who don't deal directly with the descriptions and the systems and the representations and everything around that, to help them understand what we do and why we need more support for it institutional-wide. And we've got some ideas on how to do that. We just need more people at the moment. So join the committee or get involved or come to our events. And I think the more we can get people to participate and support this, the stronger our voices can be.
Absolutely, Diane. And I mean, is your group gathering evidence for the benefit of this kind of work, and you're trying to capture, you know, what this actually does for, you know, people?
Yeah, we have a subcommittee working on that currently. One thing that we're looking at is metadata competencies as sort of an issue, which we feel like if we're able to map the wide range of things that are involved in metadata work in all settings, then people will start to see, oh, this is more than I ever thought it was before, because usually it gets a bit sidelined in the sort of overall practice of library and information work. And if we even look at the current PKSB, the new PKSB that CILIPS put out was just over a year ago. Basically everything under metadata work is grouped under what they call information management, which I don't think is accurate personally. There's a lot more to information management than metadata, and metadata covers everything that we do in any sort of library or information setting. So I think even CILIP wide, we're trying to make recommendations back to CILIP as to what else needs to be done and how we need to be supported. And that might be training, that might be better visibility, and also a better understanding holistically of how this influences every information related organization. So we are working on that a bit, but we're short on committee members at the moment. So if anyone is interested in joining the committee, please let me know, or anyone else in the committee. So we'd really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Well, so there's a huge shout out to all 105 participants. Yeah, come and get involved. And there are groups that are keen to take this work forward.
Thanks, Joe. I think Anne Cameron wants to just jump back in to follow on from one of the points Duncan raised.
Yeah, sorry, I can't do my video for some reason, but I'm sure you can live without seeing me. No, it was really just to say, Duncan, that I totally agree that in a smaller team you can often get things done faster because the relationships and the will's there. So it's not just the New Moving Image team, it's also like up at the sort of higher management level. You've got that relationship that you can say, well, we could try something smaller at least and show it as a proof that we might be able to do something bigger later. So I think I can see, I totally agree with what you're saying. And also with Diane, the idea of metadata creation, certainly in the moving image where we are, it's totally changed. It's not librarians just doing it, it's also technicians and other staff, so access staff, so there's all sorts of people creating metadata that we have to maybe guide more than anything.
Thanks, Anne. Really good comments there. And I mean, I think that leads quite nicely onto a question that's in the Q&A. So this is a question: how can we make positive changes in the context of sharing metadata through the library system? It's hard to step outside common practices in terms of subject headings, in particular as records are shared between members. And I guess, I mean, this is particularly a challenge for those of us with large collections. I mean, National Library of Scotland has 5 million records in Alma, and we are very much reliant on those those terminologies, Library of Congress, subject headings, which we all know are really slow to change as society changes. So it'd be good to perhaps see what the panel thinks about this. And should we be just doing everything locally, having sort of local thesauri and vocabularies, or does that kind of break the whole library ecosystem which relies on sharing records? Should we instead be focusing on lobbying the likes of the Library of Congress or the medical subject headings to change? What do people think about that?
If I can come in there, I think the answer to that is a sort of boring sit on the fence one, I'm afraid. That yes, we should be lobbying harder through NACO and SACO funnels and that sort of thing to get these changes pushed through. But that where we have the ability to make local changes and make a difference now for our users, then we should be going ahead and doing that. I wouldn't want to go too far in the extreme to either side. We don't want to completely detach ourselves from LCSH or FAST, but we really don't want to be stuck with completely unsatisfactory headings. The obvious example of this is the illegal aliens heading that was going to be changed and then wasn't changed in the way it was supposed to be, and so on, going way back to 2016, I think. And that's still not wholly satisfactory. And at Strathclyde, what we just did was, we're Alma users, we just went in and changed that authority heading in our own catalogue. Now that means that we contribute our records to the WorldCat and we contribute them to the Library Hub. So that means that we're not matching up to our fellow libraries for that small batch of headings, but I think that's a good sacrifice to make in that case, to make sure that we're not using that completely unsuitable terminology. But I suppose it has to be a sort of case by case for some of the worst offending pieces of terminology.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, that probably speaks to many of our experiences. Any other thoughts from the panel on this one?
I guess similarly to what Andrew was just saying, a lot of this kind of remediation for us happens within the digital preservation space, because at the point of preserving records, and I should say that, you know, when we preserve records, for those of us who are not very familiar with digital preservation, what we call an archival information package, which is essentially encapsulating the whole digital preservation service and work, is like an onion. So you've got the data, the stuff in the middle, and then around it you have layers of documentation, including the original metadata as exported by the system, and then further kinds of descriptions, so that what we call the designated community, those who will be willing to use them or should be able to understand them, will be able to understand them in the future. And it is within those layers, when we add preservation metadata to what we do and further documentation, that we incorporate these changes. Ideally, we want to preserve the records and their associated metadata as authentically as possible, but we add any other contextual information, any kind of change or suggestion in terms of let's say, you know, difficult or inappropriate terminology in those layers, because we wouldn't want to be presenting we wouldn't want to be preserving these records as they are without that additional context for the long term.
And I supposedly, I mean, that raises a really interesting question. How can an archived record like that be kept up to date? Because I mean, the thinking around it, I mean, the thinking that we're doing today is going to change in 5 years' time. You know, we'll be talking, you know, quite differently. So I mean, we could create what we think is, you know, very good inclusive metadata now, and I mean, if that's in an AIP, how are we going to go back and change that in 5, 10, 50 years' time?
So I think that this is where maybe, you know, librarians and archivists could you know, see a different approach from digital preservationists, because we are always looking at the very long term. So we're looking at preserving records, you know, for sometimes in perpetuity. And there is a difference in terms of, let's say, physical records, because of the differences in the kind of material between digital and physical, we had to do a little bit of rogue attitudes historically. So sometimes we kind of, you know, diverted from the traditional kind of librarianship and archival science principles. So what we do is that we create knowledge bases. So instead of trying to encapsulate everything within the object, even within the metadata of an object, we create external resources, external to the record resources, that as a community, we bear the mandate of maintaining, preserving them themselves in the long term, where we amass all these kinds of informational and knowledge components. So instead of pointing, or instead of creating what we call hard coding it within the record, we link it sometimes through link data, sometimes by using more traditional resources like, you know, web pages. We link it to a resource that we maintain and we preserve, and we preserve that resource within a repository separately. So by now there are so many preserved copies that at least we can say there is a chance that it will survive the passing of time. And by doing so, First, we can create economies of scale, because altering records retrospectively is a time-consuming and quite, costly process. So instead of having to do that, we create knowledge resources and we keep adding to them. We invite field experts, because as information experts, we are not omniscient. I find that sometimes the whole discussion around how do we change records so that they represent better EDI requirements puts a burden on us to either apologize about something that we haven't put together, or to interpret things but without having the full knowledge. So instead, by creating these external knowledge resources, we invite experts in this field to explain how exactly, in what context was let's say, a particular terminology used, how is it used today. And because this is maintained externally, it is updated all the time. A good example that I recently came across was preserving the University of Glasgow's old magazine. So there was a kind of a student magazine, and in many of the issues, the word queer was used in a derogatory manner. It was, as our historians and our, our colleagues in gender studies informed us, this was quite the way of insulting each other, and it was it's very common in these magazines, and anyone can access them. They're openly accessible at the university archives. This is a very good case where expert opinion on the trajectory of the term was important, because none of us could explain it entirely. By capturing it into an external resource, it means that anything else that uses the same or similar terminology can point to that resource, and that has impact on the use that our patrons, our users make of the material, and it also has impact on our students, who are able to use then these knowledge resources in their own research and their own learning.
That's so interesting, Leo, and maybe we could spend a whole workshop just exploring those issues. And for me, there's a really important point in there about not putting too much of a burden on an individual catalogue record, or indeed on an individual cataloguer. I mean, all of us are, full of our own biases, limitations. So I mean, there's something really interesting there about the sense of that external body of knowledge that's always living and growing. Really, really interesting. Any thoughts from any other panel members on this sort of question about the subject headings and how we navigate that?
No, I was just thinking when Leo was talking about that difference of, where you layer this information, and the idea of, advisory notices or so forth being layered in different places. And I think that's interesting in a library context, when you're talking about the difference between locally held records and then records that are maybe community records that you're just switching on within your discovery layer. And very early on in our discussions in the library, we decided that actually we did want to add advisory notices to community records, so records that aren't controlled by us. To not do so seemed to be a complete oversight. Why go to the trouble of adding them to local records when you're not adding them to community records? Obviously, we can't edit community records because they're shared by lots and lots of libraries. So as an ALMA user, we add local extensions to community records, and then local records, we add actual hard-coded mark field. So that's the way around it that we can. We're using the same field for both local extensions and our local mark fields. But yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting decision that I think libraries have to make. Do you just concentrate on your local records, or actually all of the other stuff that's being surfaced in your catalogue, which obviously is a huge amount for a lot of institutions? Actually, should we be looking at that as well? I mean, we have Project Gutenberg turned on in our discovery layer, and that's highly problematic for us. But so yeah, interesting.
Really interesting. Thanks, Duncan. And I mean, I might sort of actually follow on with another question for you. So bearing all that in mind, how do you ensure that a wide variety of voices are heard in making these decisions?
A combination of ways. I mean, I've already spoken about our interaction with student societies, which has been really key to us. But also staff across the library involved in this. I head up the collections team, but it's not just collections staff. So staff from our user services team are also involved in the drafting of advisory notices, having been given appropriate training. And we do exercise editorial control over that. So they do come to us and we review them before they're actually published. But we felt it was important to involve people from across teams, because it's their collection, their catalogue as much as it is ours. We're also quite heavily integrated in the various EDI committees that exist within the art school. So each of our 5 schools, faculties, have an EDI committee, and tends to be our assistant librarians that go along to those, and they always bring up lots of useful discussions, and it gives us an opportunity to explain what we're doing as well. So that's really key to us, those kinds of relationships. And then within the library, we have a very informal community of practice called the Inclusivity Group. And that, again, is across teams in the library. Anybody can go, or people don't have to go. It's not compulsory. We do take minutes, but it's not formal in any sense of the word. And we very much use that as an opportunity for people to bring issues that they've encountered. Maybe they're trying to create an advisory note about a particular resource and perhaps are lacking confidence in how they should phrase that and want to just bounce ideas off of other people. People maybe have discovered a slightly dodgy subject heading that they would like to bring to the group. Because I think we are quite aware of what you said, Joe, about the burden not falling just on one person or one group of people, that actually there is a community of practice you can go to within the library. It's, you know, it's a safe space to a certain extent, where people can bring questions that maybe they're struggling with and receive an answer. We do have a feedback tool within our catalogue. That's on every page of our catalogue, all of the results screens and so forth. That is hardly ever used. I know that somebody asked a question about that in the Q&A a while back. Very difficult to get students to engage in those kind of tools, I find. You know, it'd be interesting to know if other institutions have managed to make that work, but that we find difficult. But it is there for students to use.
Thanks, Duncan. I'm going to dive into a question in the Q&A from JC. Do you have any practical tips for how to go about making these kinds of changes to records, like updating subject headings efficiently? Does everyone have experience adding separate data vocabularies, e.g. homosaurus? Does anyone have any practical tips or any kind of resources you can point to?
But all I'll say is that I don't know what LMS the inquirer's using, but we use Alma, like I think a lot of libraries do in Scotland, and we're using normalization rules a lot to correct subject headings. You know, so if we've got a problematic subject heading, we're not going into each individual record. I'm sure this is the case with Andrew and his work as well. You know, we're using normalization rules for those. And homosaurus, yeah, we do use a variety of thesaurus. What we would like to do is find a way of surfacing subject thesauri within our LMS, Alma, in the way that it currently is able to surface Library of Congress and MESH and other kinds of more formal systems. But we'd like a way of getting the kind of more informal thesauri into Alma if we could. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, we make quite liberal use of normalization rules in Alma as well, but you can actually go into you know, your copy of LC subject headings in Alma and just edit the heading at source. And if you've got the I can't remember the name for it, but there's a sort of automatic job that runs to update authority headings. If you've got that switched on, then it should pick up anything that's got the, you know, if you want to change term A to term B, just make sure that you have term A as a 450 in the edited authority record, and Alma's automatic authority correction job should pick that up. It won't be an immediate thing, but I think in our catalogue we've got it running about once a week. But I mean, we've also noticed things like when we made changes to some of our subject headings locally, and that's fine. Like you were saying, Duncan, that's fine for our local records. We don't make an awful lot of use of community's own records, particularly for sort of ebook content. We tend to keep it local. But we did notice that we really have no influence over what's going into the front end from Primo's central discovery index. So you can make what you're providing Primo from Alma as perfect as you like, but then there's still all this kind of unmanageable metadata coming in from other sources. And Xlibris have introduced a feature where you can identify and basically hide problematic subject headings, but it's not really satisfactory to just say, well, we're just not going to have any subject heading here at all. So it's sort of, it might be appropriate in some cases, but we opted not to go with it in most of them.
It's difficult to use as well. We gave it a bit of a go, but you have to be very, very specific in the subject heading you're using. So you have to spell it out, the full subject heading you're using with all of the subdivisions for it to pull a particular subject heading from Primo display. Yeah.
In terms of integrating things like Homosaurus, we sort of cherry picked some terms from Homosaurus for the children's literature subject headings that we're working on, and what I haven't done this yet, so I can't guarantee that this works, but our plan is to use MarcEdit to basically, we have this sort of big theme index as an Excel spreadsheet at the moment. The plan is to use MarcEdit to MarcEdit's got a delimited text translator tool, so we plan to use that to then turn the whole thing into Mark authority files and import that to Alma and have our own local authority file managed in Alma that way, rather than trying to pull it straight into Primo. Can't guarantee that it'll work, but if it does, I'll let you know, Duncan.
So there's some really interesting, nitty-gritty practical things here. Is there anywhere people can go to see these kind of tips and where people can document this kind of practice?
That's a difficult question, and I think just listening to our discussion up until now, it's by what Duncan and Andrew were just saying, most of us are using proprietary systems, so we are a little bit tied to the whims of the whoever the provider is, and equally there are quirks in each system. I agree with Andrew, that would be my preferred approach, and this is what we're looking at, creating authority records from Homosaurus and other external vocabularies and taxonomies that we can incorporate into our own catalog, and that's because anything else is difficult to the point of prohibitive. So trying to document that in a way that applies to everyone is equally difficult, if not unrealistic. However, what I guess we could do as a community better is bring together other resource materials, like, for example, how do you use MarcEdit? How do you create Mark records out of an existing vocabulary that exists in XML? How can you then tie that into your local instance of library and collections management systems? All these things I think we can do better, but as far as I know, there isn't anything at the moment.
Thanks, Lou. Diane, is this something maybe your group could look at, see if there is some kind of something that we could build as a community where, because I mean, this I feel I've learned so much in this last 45 minutes. It'd be great if we could, capture this, and not have to wait for another conference to come around again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a committee meeting coming up in about a month. I'd be happy to put this on the agenda. It would be helpful as well if those of you who just made those really insightful comments, if you could even just email it to me, and then we could, look at it for consideration at the next committee meeting or even by email. It'd be really, really helpful, because I do think it's a big enough thing that it is going to be a group effort, not just within one library, but across all of us. So I'd be happy to take that to the committee and see what we can do with it, definitely.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we're at 3:30, so that's the end of the panel session. I think we could keep talking probably for the rest of the afternoon, but we'll need to leave it there. So can I thank all the panel members and all the people who asked questions as well? That's been just so interesting. And now I'll hand back to Jeanette.
Thanks so much, Joe. I think that was just fascinating, and you're right. We need to capture all this good practice and learning. This is how we share. This is what these events are about, isn't it?